The communist regime, through its secretiveness and chronic lying, has inflicted a health scourge of biblical proportions on the entire world. Knowing that a pandemic was in the making, Xi Jinping and his band of criminals bought most of the world's medical equipment from unsuspecting nations. Now they're selling it back at gouging prices. They're not trading partners. They're an imperialist enemy. Let's start by thinking of a barrel. Now let's envision planet Earth. Now imagine planet Earth over that barrel. That's what the communist Chinese regime has done to the entire world. Every country in the world is over a barrel. Xi Jinping and his partisan bandits hatched a plot worthy of an imperialist arch-villain. They saw an opportunity to hold every nation for ransom for desperately needed medical equipment to deal with the communist Chinese pandemic. While the dimwit in the White House has been telling his cult followers they should drink household disinfectant and shove an ultraviolet light up their ass to combat the virus, Communist China has been ripping off the entire world in terms of vital medical equipment for several months. Here's what they did and how they did it. When the lethal virus started to take hold in the Wuhan region, the Chinese Communist imperialists reacted by lying to the entire world about the pandemic potential. This bought them time to hatch a plot. They knew something the rest of the world didn't know. That was an opportunity. Communist Chinese security goons forcefully silenced whistleblowers like Dr. Li Wenliang, who began sounding the alarm on Chinese social media. Other citizen whistleblowers simply vanished. Meanwhile, in Australia and other Western nations, employees of multinational Chinese real estate development companies received orders to scour every retailer and buy up all medical protective equipment such as masks. The Sydney Morning Herald broke the story that several large Chinese government-owned or affiliated companies bought tons of medical supplies, cleaning out inventories across the country. This was in February, when Australia had 15 known cases of COVID-19. Greenland Group, a large real estate development company owned by the government of Shanghai, a subsidiary of the Chinese Communist Party, was one of the most aggressive at buying up Australia's PPE, protective personal equipment. The Sydney Morning Herald interviewed a whistleblower who later talked with the Australian version of 60 Minutes.
Meeting rooms, lunch rooms, and the boardroom starting to be filled with different types of items, getting unpackaged and repackaged and labelled, definitely rose my suspicion.
The whistleblower said he became suspicious because of the unusual demand that employees stop what they were doing to urgently shop for Australia's medical equipment.
The way this activity was organised, from going to procure different medical items, from the urgency to collect it, from the way it was unpackaged and repackaged, from the way full-time employees were utilised.
Greenland Group told Chinese language media outlets in Australia they had accumulated 3 million masks, 700,000 hazmat suits, and 500,000 exam gloves in a worldwide shopping spree. Greenland's Chinese executives in Australia even posted photos of their accumulated booty on social media. Rislin is another big real estate developer owned by a Chinese tycoon who is a delegate to the Communist Chinese Politburo. Rislin's Chinese executives in Australia even posed with pallets of equipment being loaded on a transport plane bound for China. Rislin grabbed 82 tons of Australian medical equipment before authorities in Australia realized what they were up to.
I feel like the horses bolted. We could have been more proactive. We could have had some sort of contingency plans.
What our witness saw was being repeated in offices in companies around the world. Over the course of 2 months, China amassed an estimated 2.4 billion pieces of protective equipment, including more than 2 billion masks.
In China, there's no such thing as private enterprise as we know it. The communist regime usually owns a significant portion of the company, or it has pumped big money into the enterprise to give it an unfair advantage in global trade. What should we know about Greenland Group and Rislin? Greenland Group is remaking the skyline of downtown Los Angeles. A combination of office towers, hotel, and residential luxury units is valued at $1 billion. Greenland is also the prime developer of the massive Atlantic Yards development in Brooklyn, New York. Online, Greenland describes itself as state-owned. That's a bland business page code phrase meaning the Chinese Communist government owns the company. It would be interesting and more factual if U.S. newspapers called these companies Communist Chinese government-owned when writing about them. Rislin, the Chinese company whose executives posed for pictures at the airport with a portion of the 82 tons of medical supplies they bought under the radar in Australia, has its U.S. headquarters in Plano, Texas, a suburb of Dallas. They are developing a massive residential complex outside Dallas known as Mantua. Did Greenland and Rislin engage in the same deception in the United States? We don't know, but we do know this. Public Citizen, the consumer advocacy group, analyzed U.S. Customs export data and found that in January and February alone, U.S. companies sold massive amounts of medical personal protective equipment and ventilators to China. The number of face masks we exported to China jumped 1,315% over the same 2 months a year ago. While this was happening, U.S. intelligence agencies repeatedly warned the White House in January and February that a pandemic was in the making. Public Citizen's export data indicates Communist China bought nearly $4.8 billion in medical PPE equipment from the United States in the first 2 months of this year as the pandemic was gaining traction in the lungs of people everywhere. U.S. hospitals, clinics, and first responders have been begging for face masks ever since. Greenland and Rislin have acknowledged they went on a worldwide medical equipment shopping spree at Beijing's direction. Since then, there have been complaints from countries around the world that Chinese suppliers have been selling needed medical equipment back to them at inflated, gouging prices. The state of New York, for instance, has paid up to 15 times the normal price for medical supplies that are critical to the struggle against the pandemic. The evidence shows Xi Jinping's imperial regime deliberately created a global shortage of medical equipment as the pandemic grew in scope and intensity. A European Union official in Brussels says there's a global scramble for the essential medical equipment the Communist Chinese regime bought up before the world realized a pandemic was in the making. Some think the virus sprang from an infected bat. Communist China's leader, Xi Jinping, has acted like a blood-sucking bat since the world-changing pandemic began. The ripoff by Communist China's leaders didn't end with the global buying spree. Western companies that make protective medical equipment in China had their factories seized by the communist imperialists. Guillaume Lavaudour is the North American president of Medicom, a Montreal, Canada-based maker of medical equipment. He told Australia's 60 Minutes his company's facilities in China were confiscated by force by the communist regime.
So we have 3 factories in China and a factory in Shanghai where the production was requisitioned by the government of China. So the government sent people to take control of the inventory and the production in our factory.
Xi Jinping and his imperial bandits did everything possible to position China so the world would be almost totally dependent on their corrupt regime for supplies to fight the global pandemic. When nations objected to the gouging scheme, Communist China first said the world should thank us. This was soon followed by threats. When the Australian government started pushing for an international investigation of China's handling of information about the pandemic, Communist China threatened a boycott of Australia, involving students, tourists, and agriculture trade worth billions of dollars. Through the government-run Xinhua news agency, the Communist Chinese regime also threatened America. Xinhua suggested China may retaliate by halting drug exports to the United States. The story said the U.S. will be caught in the sea of new coronavirus. China provides the United States with 97% of key medications such as antibiotics and heart and blood pressure drugs. The Xi regime, as part of their standard propaganda tactics, has accused the United States and the West of racism for criticizing their corrupt government. Peter Jennings of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute says it's clear China is trying to gain economic advantage over the entire world through the pandemic.
I really hope that this is the wake-up call we've needed, Andrew, to stop being naive about the relationship we have with China and to understand that the Chinese Communist Party is looking to gain advantage over us, not to partner with us.
If Democrats hope to win in November, one of the key issues will be national security. The Democrats are going to have to show the same willingness to take on the Chinese Communist regime that they showed with Imperial Japan in World War II. 2,403 died at Pearl Harbor. So far, over 50,000 Americans have died from the Chinese Communist virus, and another 26 million have lost their jobs. Democrats need to face facts. Another imperialist Asian nation is now America's enemy.